Our final video of this week is about lamid hey verbs, verbs whose final root letter is a hey. Because the letter hey is basically just the sound of breath, it is, I think, the weakest of the four weak letters. The weak letters, again, are hey, vav, yod, and nun. And the hey, I think, is the weakest of them. The hey most often will appear at the end of a verb. It just seems like there's a lot of verbs, and some of them very common, that conclude with a hey. And the hey, when it's on the end, it will just simply disappear in several different, very specific contexts. So the textbook actually does a pretty nice job of explaining these. So I'm just going to walk through the textbook's 5 points, starting on page 156, and just kind of process through them with you. So number 1, on page 156, the textbook author says that the hey of the root, when it's the last letter, it drops off when you have a verb ending, she says, but generally this is going to be either an affix or a prefix complement. And the first one is when that verb ending, if it's an affix or a prefix complement, and sometimes a participle ending, when that ending begins with a vowel, the hey will disappear. Later on, she's going to say, when that ending begins with a consonant, the hey will disappear. So pretty much, if you have an ending that either an affix or a prefix complement that comes on the end of the verb, that hey will disappear. But it'll disappear in different ways, leaving different traces, if you will, depending on whether the verbal ending begins with a vowel or a consonant, which is the author's point. So here at point number 1, when the verb ending begins with a vowel, the hey just simply disappears. So you can see here the first one, I'll just do the first one as a third common plural perfect form in lakal, katlu. Instead of bahu, it's just bahu. Bahu. So that hey just disappears. It doesn't matter what verb stem it's in. It doesn't matter about any of that. It's if there's something attached to it, which means there's a consonant on one side that's a part of the root, which would be the second root letter, and then something on the other side, that hey gets claustrophobic and it just poof, disappears. Okay, moving on to number 2. The second point that the author makes is an important one to remember. In the vav consecutive form, so vav consecutive again is an imperfect form onto which you place a vav, followed by a patach and a dagesh forte in the prefix, because it's imperfect, so it's going to have a prefix. In the vav consecutive, the hey always drops off. Always. So let's take the example of haya, which is a verb we've used in previous videos. Hey, yod, hey. The imperfect third masculine singular form is simply, this is in the pa'al, yihye. Yihye, right? So you see all 3 letters remain, add the prefix, boom, bada bing. Okay, now in the vav consecutive, you add the vav and the patach, and the hey falls off. And of course, this final vowel falls off as well. You can't end with a shava and a yod, so that becomes a hirik yod, and this shortens to being shava. You don't have to understand why all that happens, but the point is that the hey on the end here disappears. So you have this very, very, very common form, vayihi. Vayihi. Okay, let's take another example. Yigale. Okay, this is a PL, third masculine singular imperfect. Yigale from the root gimel lamid hey, which is to uncover or to go into exile. When you add your vav and patach for the vowel consecutive, this also doesn't take a dagesh in the prefix because of the shava of the PL. The hey falls off again, and therefore the final vowel has to fall off, and you're left with vayigal. Vayigal, which is, and you can't end it with a dagesh forte, so vayigal. And if this was a third masculine plural form, it'd be vayigalu. Okay, so that hey just falls off in every form of the vav consecutive. Thirdly, the textbook author points out, this is the corresponding one to number 1, that when there's some sort of verbal ending, again, whether affix or a prefix complement, when that ending begins with a consonant, before it was a vowel, when that ending begins with a consonant, the hey transforms into a yod. So let me illustrate that for you. Let's say we have this very common word, Allah, Allah, to go up or to ascend. In the second masculine singular, the affix is a tav followed by a kametz. So what happens here is it doesn't say, oops, you can't have that hey followed by the affix. So the hey gets claustrophobic, it disappears. The affix comes on, but because it starts with a consonant, you get this yod as a linking vowel put in there. It doesn't mean anything. Alita. Alita. Okay, so for lamid hey, in the second person forms and the first person forms, this is affix now, that hey is turned into a hirik yod. In most stems. In one stem, I think it turns into a tsere yod, but generally it turns into a hirik yod. So let me just illustrate what this would be if this was a normal verb. Let's use the verb shatak, which means to be quiet. If this was in, oh no, let's use a verb that you know. Shachav. Shachav, to lie down. If this was in the second person masculine singular like this, it would be shachav ta. Shachavta. Okay, so you can see the difference there. This hey turns into a hirik yod. Okay, number 4. Talked about this in a previous video, but in the third feminine singular affix of every single lamid hey verb, remember that when this shorthand reminds us that even though when you have this weak letter, it's an irregularity, it's regular, it's consistent. It's regular in its irregularity. So every time you have a verb that ends in a hey, every lamid hey verb, in the third feminine singular form, the hey will turn into a tav. So let's use another very common verb, asa. Okay, asa, when this goes into the third feminine singular, the affix of the third feminine singular is a kametz. Hey, you can't have this. Hebrew doesn't like that at the end of a verb. And so, this hey turns into a tav. See that? Very simple. Visually, it's almost no different. So now for the third feminine singular, you have asta. Asta. So what it would be in a normal, let's use shachav again. It's the same pattern, right? It's the same vowel pattern, but this hey transforms into the tav. Shachva, all three root letters remain here. Hey is a tav. Asta. Something you'll want to listen for as you're hearing yourself read words. Finally, number 5, this is on the top of page 158 now. In the infinitive construct, the sign of the infinitive construct within the lamid hey, so, or maybe a better way to put that is when you have a lamid hey verb that goes into or appears in the infinitive construct, it will have a unique sign beyond the normal sign, which is usually the presence of a preposition attached to the verbal root. In addition to that, you'll have an ending, a unique ending, that the hey, as I just was saying in number 4, the hey often will turn into a tav. It does this in other places too. For instance, a feminine singular construct and a noun, right? You remember when you have a feminine singular noun that ends in a comets hey, when that gets in construct, it turns into a tav. Well, the same is true here. The hey often will turn into a tav. So if you, let's use asa again. So here's our verbal root, ayin, sin, hey. When this verb appears in the infinitive construct, then the hey turns into a tav, but it does so with a vav between. So the lamid hey infinitive construct ending is ot. Polam vav tav. Similar to the feminine plural noun ending, which is not surprising in some ways because infinitive constructs are verbal nouns, but I don't think that they have anything to do with each other, to be honest. Context will tell you, and you'll know that it's a verb and not a noun in these situations, but Holam Vav Tav is the way that the hey manifests itself in the infinitive construct. So that's one example, and here's an example of what a normal pa'al, this is pa'al, what a normal pa'al infinitive construct looks like is leak tol. Right, so our root here is kof, tate, lamid. You got your preposition. Actually, this is usually going to be la asot, like that. Leak tol, you got your preposition, and your holam vav here. Also a holam here between the sin and what used to be the hey. So that's the lamid hey verb. It has some interesting nuances to it, but it's regular in its irregularity, and it functions and adapts from the norm in predictable ways.